What would you do if the person you resented most turned out to be the only one who could save your life and your soul? Asterisk, he signed the papers in a moment of desperation. Certain a mail-order bride was nothing more than a practical solution to a lonely frontier life. But when the deadliest storm of 1885 descended on the Dakota Territory, the woman he had coldly ignored for 3 months became the only thing standing between him and death. And he had never even learned her middle name. Asterisk. We've all made decisions we immediately regretted, commitments made in haste, choices that felt wrong the moment they were final. But most of us never had to live side by side with our mistake, sharing a table, a roof, and a silence thick enough to cut with a knife. Asterisk, Elias Croft was not the kind of guy who did anything halfway. Dude was built different, 34 years old, leather tough, with hands that looked like they'd been through a war and a jaw set so hard you'd think his face forgot how to relax. He ran his wheat farm out in the Dakota Territory the same way he did everything else. No nonsense, no fluff, just get it done and move on. The man was straight up allergic to anything that even smelled like weakness, but here's the thing. Nobody talks about when they glorify the whole. Rugged frontier life, that life will grind you down to dust if you're out there doing it solo. And Elias? He was doing it completely solo. Had been for 2 years, ever since he lost his wife Margaret to fever in the spring of 1883. And yeah, he grieved, but not in any way anybody could see. He just swallowed it whole, locked it in a box somewhere deep in his chest, and kept farming. Classic Elias moved out by the time winter of 1884 rolled through. Homie was running on fumes. The farmhouse was a disaster. Meals were whatever required the least amount of effort. Laundry? Don't even ask. His neighbor, old Frank Tillman, pulled him aside one afternoon and straight up told him, "No sugarcoating, Elias. You need a woman in that house or this farm is going to fall apart around your ears." Now Elias wanted to be offended. He really did. But Frank wasn't wrong, and Elias Croft was too practical a man to argue with facts just because they stung. So he did what any totally emotionally unavailable, hyperlogical, grief-dodging man of the 1880s would do. He wrote to a matchmaking agency. And let's be crystal clear about his mindset going into this, because it matters. This was not a love story decision. This was a business decision. The man literally sat down at his kitchen table, made a list of what he needed: someone who could cook, clean, manage a household, handle frontier winters, and wrote that list out like he was ordering farm equipment. Zero romance. Zero hope. Just logistics. When the agency wrote back with Clara Voss, a schoolteacher from Columbus, Ohio, Elias read her profile like he was skimming a supply catalog. Looked fine on paper. He said yes. Sent the fare for her train ticket. Done deal. April 1885, Clara steps off the afternoon train, and she is not what Elias pictured. Not even close. She's composed. She's got this calm, steady way about her. Not timid, not giggly. Not overwhelmed by the dusty chaos of a Dakota train platform. She looks around like she's sizing the whole situation up, which, honestly, she was. And Elias? He walked up, shook her hand, like she was a business associate, and handed her a folded piece of paper with a list of household responsibilities on it. No hug, no smile. No welcome, glad you're here. Just a handshake and a chore list. Straight up iconic levels of emotional unavailability right there. He loaded her trunk onto the wagon, clicked the horses forward, and the two of them rode the 4 miles back to the farm in almost complete silence. The kind of silence that sits heavy and says everything neither person is saying out loud. Clara stared at the flat, endless horizon stretching out ahead of her and thought, Lord, what did I just walk into? Elias stared at the road and thought nothing. Or so he told himself. He was already wrong. So here's what Elias Croft expected when he sent for a wife. Somebody quiet. Somebody who would stay in her lane, keep the house running smooth. Maybe say yes sir and no sir and not ask too many questions. Basically a human appliance with good cooking skills. That's the whole vision he had mapped out in his head. Clean, simple, no complications. What he got was Clara Voss. And Clara Voss did not get the memo. First week she's on the farm. This woman rearranged his entire kitchen. Not asked about it. Not suggested it. Just did it. Moved everything around, reorganized his shelves. Tossed out 3 cracked bowls he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. And had supper on the table by the time he came in from the fields. A real supper, too. Not the sad bread and salt situation Elias had been running with all winter. Elias stood in the doorway of his own kitchen looking around like he'd walked into the wrong house. He didn't say thank you. He sat down and ate every single bite, though. Every single bite. Week 2. He catches her out by the barn teaching herself to ride his horse. Dutchman, a big ornery roan that had thrown 2 farmhands in the past year. Clara's up there, calm as anything, talking low to that horse like they're having a private conversation. Dutchman, who hated basically everybody, was standing there eating it up. Elias watched from across the yard for a solid minute, jaw tight, and then walked away without saying a word because he genuinely did not know what to do with that information, and it just kept going like that. Clara was out here doing the absolute most, in the best way, and Elias was losing his mind about it. She started checking in on the neighbor family down the road, the Hendersons, whose youngest boy had come down sick. Just showed up with soup and stayed to help without anybody asking her to. The whole township started talking about how warm and capable the new Croft wife was. People Elias had known for years were coming up to him at the general store saying things like, "You got yourself a real good one, Elias." And he'd just nod and change the subject because what was he supposed to say? See, here's the real problem. Elias wasn't cold toward Clara because he disliked her. He was cold toward her because something about her presence in that house messed with the tight little system of numbness he'd spent 2 years carefully constructing. Every time she laughed at something, and she laughed easy, which drove him absolutely crazy, it poked a hole in something he needed to keep sealed. She was too alive, too real, too much of everything he'd decided he wasn't allowed to want anymore. So he doubled down on the silence. Short sentences at dinner. 0 eye contact unless absolutely necessary. Treated every conversation like a business transaction and got out as fast as possible. Clara, to her absolute credit, did not fold. She didn't cry about it, at least not where he could see. She wrote letters back home to her sister in Columbus admitting that her husband was the most emotionally locked up human being she had ever encountered in her entire life. But she also wrote that she hadn't crossed 6 states to quit on herself. She came to build a life and she was going to build one, with or without Elias Croft's cooperation. She was playing a long game. Elias didn't even know. He was in a game that was already her advantage. Nobody talks about how change sneaks up on you. It doesn't show up at your door with an announcement and a brass band. It just quietly moves in, one small moment at a time, until one day you look around and realize everything is different and you can't even pinpoint exactly when it happened. That's precisely what went down between Elias and Clara during those late summer months of 1885. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say, there, that's the moment. Just a slow, quiet thaw happening underneath all that frost Elias had been carrying around like it was his whole personality. It started with small stuff. Tiny things that didn't mean anything on their own but meant everything added together. Elias started coming in from the fields 5 minutes earlier than usual. Not enough that you'd clock it right away, but Clara noticed. She noticed everything. He started leaving his boots outside the door instead of tracking mud across her clean floors without a second thought like he'd been doing all spring. No conversation about it. No big declaration. He just quietly started doing it. Clara didn't say a word. Just noted it privately and kept moving. Then there were the wildflowers. Nobody could explain the wildflowers. Elias sure wasn't going to. But twice, Clara came out onto the porch in the early morning and found a small bunch of prairie wildflowers sitting on the rail. Not wrapped up fancy or anything. Just sitting there like maybe the wind blew them in from somewhere. Except there was no wind. And they were the exact kind that grew along the east ridge where Elias walked every morning to check the wheat. Clara picked them up both times, put them in a jar of water on the windowsill, and never once brought it up to him directly. But she smiled about it for the rest of both those days, and her sister in Columbus heard every detail in the next letter. For his part, Elias started noticing things about Clara he'd been working hard to ignore. The way she was always the last one to give up on anything, a stubborn jar lid, a difficult recipe, the Henderson boys' reading lessons she'd taken on unofficially on Sunday afternoons. The woman did not quit on anything, ever. And somewhere in the back of that locked-up chest of his, something about that consistency started feeling less annoying and more like something he recognized. Something he respected. He'd never in his life say that out loud. But it was happening whether he authorized it or not. They even had a real conversation in August, an actual back and forth that lasted more than 4 exchanges. It was about the harvest yield, completely practical, but they went back and forth for 20 minutes and neither one of them ended it abruptly. Elias made a dry joke, didn't even fully mean to, and Clara laughed that easy laugh of hers, and for about 3 seconds he forgot to look uncomfortable about it. 3 whole seconds. Growth. But underneath all this quiet progress, something else was building. The sky over the Dakota Territory in late September started doing things that made older folks go quiet when they looked at it. That heavy, strange yellow-green color bleeding into the horizon at dusk. Animals acting restless and weird, Dutchmen refusing to settle at night, the farm dogs staying pressed close to the house. Old-timer at the feed store told Elias point blank, "Something mean is coming this winter. Mark my words." Elias nodded politely and bought his supplies and didn't think another thing about it. Clara bought extra candles, extra flour, extra matches, and said nothing. She was already preparing for what was coming. He was still pretending the sky looked normal. That difference right there? That was about to matter more than either of them knew. So let's talk about the moment everything changed. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Because up until this point, Elias and Clara had been doing this careful, fragile little dance around each other. Small cracks forming. Tiny moments of something almost like warmth. It wasn't much, but it was progress. It was real. Then the storm showed up and flipped the whole table. See, people today don't fully grasp what a blizzard meant on the Dakota Plains in 1885. This wasn't some inconvenient snowstorm that shut down schools and got people complaining on social media. This was a full-on biblical-level weather event. The kind that didn't care how tough you were, how long you'd survived out there, or how well you thought you knew that land. The great blizzard of 1885 came through like nature itself had a personal vendetta against every living thing on the frontier. Temperatures dropped so fast and so hard that livestock froze standing up. Men who stepped outside and lost their bearings for 60 seconds didn't come back. The cold wasn't just cold. It was predatory. And Elias being completely and totally Elias. Went outside anyway. The sky had been doing that eerie yellow-green thing all morning. The kind of sky that makes animals nervous and old-timers go quiet. Clara had told him the night before, calm but serious, that something bad was building. She'd been reading everything she could get her hands on about frontier weather patterns since she arrived, because that's just who Clara was, always preparing, always paying attention. She told him straight up, "Elias, I think we need to get ready for something serious." He nodded like he heard her. He did not hear her dot, so when the first wall of white hit that afternoon, Elias was outside. Not because he's dumb, because he was trying to save the livestock, which honestly, very on brand for a man who poured all his feelings into his farm. He got the animals into the barn, but when he turned around to head back to the house, the blizzard had already gone full blackout mode. Whiteout conditions so thick he literally could not see his own hand in front of his face. The wind was screaming so loud it was like the whole world had been replaced by noise. 40 feet. That's all that stood between him and the front door. 40 feet and Elias Croft was completely, totally, life-threateningly lost. He dropped to his knees in the snow. Disoriented, freezing, burning up with cold the way only true frostbite can make you burn. Men died this way all across the territory that exact night, found the next morning just yards from their own front doors. And Elias was right there on the edge of becoming one of those stories, and then he heard her, Clara's voice cutting through that howling wind, not screaming in panic, not crying, just calling his name steady and strong like a lighthouse beam slicing through fog. She had tied a rope, their longest rope, to the porch post, wrapped the other end around her waist, and walked straight into that blinding white after him. Bare hands. Zero hesitation. Just went. She found him 30 feet from the door, grabbed him by the coat with both hands and pulled. This schoolteacher from Columbus, Ohio, dragged a full-grown frontier farmer through a lethal blizzard and got him back inside that farmhouse through sheer stubborn will alone. Inside. She didn't panic. Didn't collapse. She got that fire roaring, treated his frostbitten hands with steady, careful fingers, and sat watch over him through the entire long howling night, never once leaving his side. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness, and every single time he opened his eyes, she was there. Still there. Always there. The man who thought he needed nobody was alive, because somebody refused to leave him behind. Let that sink in. There's something about almost dying that has a way of rearranging your whole perspective. Like, the things you thought were solid start looking real fragile, and the things you kept dismissing start looking like everything. Elias Croft spent 3 days flat on his back recovering, and for a man who hadn't been still a single day in 2 years, that stillness hit different. Real different. He couldn't work. Couldn't escape to the fields. Couldn't busy himself into numbness the way he'd been doing since Margaret died. His frostbitten hands meant he couldn't even hold a tool properly. So for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, Elias Croft had nothing to do but lie there and think. And think. And think some more. And brother, the thinking wrecked him completely. It started small, just replaying the storm in his head. The snow. The white. The moment his legs gave out and he genuinely believed that was it for him. And then her voice. Then her hands on his coat. Then waking up warm by the fire with Clara sitting right there, calm and steady. Like keeping a half-frozen stubborn man alive was just another thing on her to-do list. He replayed that sequence probably 100 times in those 3 days, and every single time it hit him harder than the last. Because here's what was destroying Elias from the inside out. This woman had saved his life. Not a neighbor, not a friend he'd known for decades. The woman he had treated like a piece of furniture since the day she stepped off that train. The woman he'd handed a chore list to instead of a welcome. The woman he'd eaten beside in deliberate silence for months, offering nothing, giving nothing, making her feel like she was invisible in her own home. That woman walked. into a lethal blizzard for him, and he hadn't even learned her middle name. That thought specifically, and we're talking about a man who was not given to emotional spiraling. That thought broke something open in Elias that had been sealed shut for 2 solid years. Because it wasn't just guilt about how he'd treated Clara. It was bigger than that. It was the moment he finally had to look directly at what he'd been running from since Margaret died. He hadn't just shut Clara out. He'd shut everything out. He'd taken all that grief, all that loss, all that fear of ever hurting like that again. And he'd built walls so thick he convinced himself they were just who he was now, practical, efficient, unbothered. He dressed his brokenness up in work boots and called it strength. It wasn't strength. It was hiding. And lying there with bandaged hands and a humbled heart. Elias Croft finally had to admit that to himself. When Clara came in that evening to check on him, something was different in his eyes, and she noticed immediately, because Clara noticed everything. He looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since April, and then this man, this locked up, shut down, emotionally fortified Dakota farmer, opened his mouth and apologized. Not a quick sorry about that either. A real one. The kind that costs something. The kind that comes from a man who has genuinely reckoned with himself. Clara listened. Didn't rush to comfort him. Didn't immediately let him off the hook. She looked him dead in the eyes and told him straight. She did not cross half. The country to spend her life being invisible. It wasn't romantic. It was realer than romance. It was 2 broken people finally deciding to be honest. And honestly, that was worth every single storm it took to get there. Spring of 1886. Hit the Dakota Territory like a slow exhale after holding your breath for way too long. The snow pulled back, the ground thawed out, and something else thawed out too. Something inside that farmhouse that nobody would have predicted 6 months earlier. Because the Elias Croft who walked into that spring was not the same man who had handed a woman a chore list and called it a welcome. That guy was gone. And honestly, good riddance to him. Here's the thing about real change, and pay attention because this part matters. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic music and a big speech. It shows up quiet. It shows up in the small stuff. It shows up in the way Elias started actually talking at dinner instead of performing silence like it was an Olympic sport. In the way he'd ask Clara's opinion about the farm and then, wild concept, actually listen to what she said. In the way he stopped treating every moment of potential connection like a threat to be neutralized. The walls weren't just down. They'd been dismantled, brick by brick. And something better was getting built in their place. And Clara, listen, Clara Roosevelt Croft was that girl. Always had been. She didn't come into this new chapter of their marriage skipping around like everything was suddenly perfect, because she was too honest for that and too smart for that. She came in with her eyes open, same way she'd done everything since she stepped off that train. She gave Elias her trust the same way she'd given him everything else. Not all at once, but steady, consistent, real. She made him earn it, and that was exactly right. They started learning each other. Actually learning each other, not the surface version, not the functional roommate version, but the real version. Elias found out her middle name was Rose, which she'd gotten from her grandmother in Cincinnati. And something about finally knowing that simple little fact hit him. Somewhere deep because it represented everything he'd refused to see before. Clara found out that Elias used to fill entire sketchbooks with detailed drawings of birds as a kid. Cardinals, meadowlarks, hawks, and completely stopped the day Margaret died. Like he'd packed that part of himself away with her things. Clara didn't make a big deal about it. She just quietly left a fresh sketchbook on his workbench one afternoon and walked away. He picked it up 3 days later. Drew a meadowlark. Didn't say anything about it. She saw it on the bench and smiled to herself. That was their whole language now, quiet, deliberate, genuine. No performance. No pretending. Just two real people who'd been through something together and come out the other side changed for the better. The farm was still, struggling financially. One good storm doesn't fix bad harvests, but they were working it together now, side by side, making decisions as a team instead of Elias white-knuckling everything alone like some kind of martyr farmer. Clara had ideas too, practical ones, and Elias had learned, the hard way, nearly the fatal way, that ignoring her was a losing strategy every single time. By late spring, Elias sat down and wrote a letter to the matchmaking agency. Not a complaint, not a formality, just a plain, handwritten note from a man who had finally gotten out of his own way, long enough to recognize what he had. He wrote, "I ordered practical help and received something I didn't know I was starving for. I have never been more grateful to have been so wrong." He meant every single word, and Clara Rosecroft, reading over his shoulder, said nothing. She just put her hand on his and stayed right there, right where she'd always been.